Welcome back. In the vast, silent places of this world, what is the most dangerous sound you can hear? Is it the growl of a predator in the dark? The crack of a falling tree? Or is it something else entirely? Something far more unsettling, like the sound of a familiar voice, when you know with absolute certainty that you are completely alone. Tonight's story is about a voice in the dark. It comes to us from a remote fire lookout tower, a glass box on stilts perched high in the mountains of Montana, miles from any town, any road, any other human soul. It is the story of a young woman named Jenna, who went to that lonely peak for a season of solitude to honor the memory of her late father. A veteran of the search and rescue service, she carried with her his most important piece of equipment and his most important rule. Whatever you hear on the emergency radio after midnight is not for you, and you must never answer. Tonight, we journey to that lonely peak and listen in on the silence. This is the story of Jenna and the voices that came for her after midnight. The final broadcast from Fire Lookout Station 73 was never officially logged. It wasn't a call for help, nor was it a standard weather report. It was just a weak, circular transmission on a closed channel, captured by accident by a ham radio operator 300 miles away. It was the voice of a young woman, Jenna, her voice strained and thin, a voice that sounded like it had been screaming for a very long time. In the recording, she spoke of the rules her father had taught her, the ones that kept you alive in the wilderness, and she spoke of the one single rule she had broken. She didn't speak of monsters with claws or ghosts in the dark. She spoke only of a voice, a terrible, patient voice that came in on the radio after the sun had died and the world had gone to sleep. Some voices are just echoes, she whispered, her words dissolving into static. Hungry echoes, and you should never, ever answer an echo. Jenna arrived at the tower in the late afternoon, after a 2-hour drive up a winding, treacherous dirt road that was more of a suggestion than a path. The higher she climbed, the more the world of neat lawns and paved streets fell away, replaced by an endless, rolling ocean of pine and rock. The air grew thin and cool. By the time her truck reached the final clearing, she felt as though she had arrived at the very top of the world. The lookout tower, Station 73, was a single 15 by 15 foot room, a glass box perched on 100-foot stilts of steel and timber. It was a lonely, skeletal outpost against the vast blue sky. Below it, the forest stretched out in every direction, a silent, green sea that continued all the way to the horizon. This was to be her home for the next 3 months, a perfect, profound isolation. And that was exactly what she wanted. Her father had died in the spring, a sudden heart attack that had left a gaping, silent hole in her life. He had been a search and rescue man, a hero who had spent his life walking into the wilderness to bring others out. He had loved this place, this tower. He worked here for 2 seasons when he was young. Coming here was Jenna's pilgrimage, her own strange way of grieving. She hoped that by living in his silence, by seeing the world through his eyes, she might feel close to him one last time. She spent the first few hours with a determined, practiced efficiency, a trait she had inherited from him. She unpacked her modern gear first, the satellite phone for emergencies, the solar charger, the laptop filled with books. Then, with a reverence she didn't know she possessed, she unpacked his. The first was his old emergency radio. It was a heavy black box of analog dials and bakelite knobs, a relic from a different era. It was clunky and inefficient compared to her modern equipment, but it was his. She placed it carefully on the central desk. The second was his journal. It was a thick, leather-bound book, its cover softened and worn from years of being in his pack. Inside were not just official SAR notes, but his thoughts, his fears, his life, all recorded in his familiar, steady handwriting. She ran her thumb over the worn leather, the object a tangible link to the man she had lost. As the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the valley below, a fragile sense of peace settled over Jenna for the first time in months. The world was loud, chaotic, and full of painful memories. But up here, there was only the wind and the sky. She felt small, wonderfully insignificant, and closer to her father than she had felt since the day he died. She had no idea that she was not alone, and that the profound silence of the mountain was about to be broken. The first night in the tower was unlike any she had ever experienced. As darkness consumed the endless forest below, the world outside the glass walls of her perch dissolved into a perfect, profound blackness. Above, a billion stars glittered in the thin, clear mountain air, a cold and silent celestial ocean. The sense of isolation was absolute. She was a lone astronaut in a tiny capsule, adrift in a sea of quiet wilderness. She made a simple dinner, read a few chapters of a book, and let the silence of the mountain seep into her. Following the habits her father had drilled into her, she had left his old emergency radio on, the volume turned low. It sat on the desk, a silent sentinel, its speaker emitting nothing but the faintest, gentlest hiss of static, a sound she found oddly comforting. For hours, that was the only sound besides the whisper of the wind against the glass. The clock on her phone ticked past 10, then 11. The wind died down, and the silence deepened further, becoming a heavy, waiting presence. Jenna felt a deep sense of peace, a feeling that she was truly alone with her memories. Then, the clock struck midnight. As if on cue, the radio crackled. It was a harsh, loud burst of static that made her jump in her seat. The gentle hiss was gone, replaced by a sound like grinding rocks. Through the noise, a voice began to break through. It was faint, distorted, and so weak it was barely a whisper. It was impossible to tell if it was a man or a woman. The voice spoke a single, broken word, stretched out over several seconds. Heal me. Jenna's training, her every instinct, screamed at her to respond. She lunged for the radio, her hand reaching for the microphone handset, her mind already running through the official distress call protocol. A hiker, fallen and injured. A climber, trapped in the dark. Someone needed her help. But just as her fingers were about to close around the cold plastic of the microphone, her father's voice echoed in her memory, as clear and as firm as if he were standing right next to her. Whatever you hear on the emergency radio after midnight is not for you, and you must never, ever answer. Her hand froze, hovering just inches from the radio. The distorted voice came again, a little clearer this time, a ghostly plea through the static. Is anyone there? She was torn. Every fiber of her being, the part of her that was her father's daughter, wanted to respond, to offer help and comfort. But the memory of his warning was absolute, a command forged from a lifetime of experience she couldn't comprehend. With a trembling hand, she reached out, but instead of grabbing the microphone, she seized the volume knob and twisted it hard to the left. The radio clicked off, the static vanished. The voice was gone. Jenna sat there in the sudden, total silence of the tower, her heart hammering against her ribs. The peace of the mountain was gone, shattered. She was now alone in the dark with the terrifying, chilling realization that her father's strange rule was not just a story. It was a warning about something that was out there, listening in the night. The next morning, the sun rose over a world that felt fundamentally different. The peaceful, majestic wilderness that had comforted Jenna the day before now seemed to hold a menacing, watchful quality. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the sound of that faint, distorted voice from the radio. She tried to rationalize it as she made her morning coffee, her movements stiff and robotic. It was a stray signal, she told herself. A prankster with a powerful transmitter, a glitch in the old equipment. But none of those explanations could account for the cold, absolute certainty in her father's warning. His rule was the one piece of the puzzle that didn't fit with any logical explanation. She needed to understand it. She needed context. After her coffee, she sat down at the central table and opened her father's old, leather-bound journal. The book was a familiar comfort, its pages filled with his steady, practical handwriting. For an hour, she sifted through the entries, most of which were exactly what she expected. Technical notes on rope tying techniques, observations on weather patterns, and dryly humorous accounts of dealing with lost tourists. It was the voice of the capable, rational man she had always known. And then she found it. It was a short, sharp entry, written in a different, more urgent hand. The words heavily underlined. Rule has on for the high peaks. Radio silence after midnight. No exceptions. Period. Jenna stared at the words. It wasn't just a piece of advice he'd given her. It was a core principle he had lived by, important enough to write down and underline twice. The entry confirmed the seriousness of the rule, but it offered no explanation, leaving her with a deeper sense of unease. She continued to turn the pages, her search now more focused. A dozen pages later, she found another entry that made her stop. Sound travels strangely up here, her father had written, especially near the western ridge. Atmospheric inversion, maybe. The old-timers call it the silent peak for a reason. Jenna instinctively looked up from the journal and out the western window of the tower. There, in the distance, was a single, jagged, and treeless peak, its gray stones dark against the blue sky. She looked back down at the page and read the final, chilling sentence. Sometimes you hear things that aren't there, and sometimes you don't hear things that are. Jenna closed the journal, the weight of her father's unspoken secrets feeling heavier than ever. His notes had confirmed her fear, not eased it. The radio call wasn't just a random event. It was part of a known phenomenon, a phenomenon tied to a specific, named place on her map. She looked back out at the silent peak, no longer seeing it as a simple mountain, but as the source of a threat she could not begin to comprehend. The second night was a crucible of suspense. The fragile peace she had felt upon arrival had been completely erased, replaced by a tense, suffocating anticipation. She didn't read, she couldn't focus. She just sat at the central table, the open journal of her father beside her, and watched the old emergency radio as if it were a coiled snake. She had left it on. After a night of wrestling with her fear, she had decided she couldn't live with the not knowing. She had to face it. As the clock on her phone ticked past 11:59 p.m., she held her breath. The wind outside had died down, and the mountain was wrapped in a profound silence. The world seemed to be listening with her. The moment the clock turned to midnight, the radio crackled to life. The burst of static, a jarring explosion in the quiet room. Jenna flinched, her muscles tensing for the same faint, garbled plea for help she had heard the night before. But the voice that broke through the static this time was different. It was clearer, closer, and it was not asking for help. It was whispering her name. It was a sound both intimate and monstrously alien. The voice was a dry, rasping thing, a composite of static and what sounded like dead leaves, skittering across rock. It tried to say her name, and the result was a chilling, fragmented sound. Jenna. Jenna recoiled from the radio as if she had been burned, a cry of pure terror catching in her throat. Her mind, which had spent the day trying to rationalize the previous night's call, was now faced with an undeniable, horrifying truth. This was not a stray signal. This was not a prank. The distorted voice crackled through the speaker again. Its tone was a strange mix of curiosity and menace. Where are you? Her blood ran cold. The feeling of isolation she had sought as a comfort had just become her greatest vulnerability. She was in a glass box on top of the world, a single tiny beacon of life in a vast, dark wilderness, and something out there, something that knew her name, was now looking for her. The first call had been a random hook cast into the dark. Tonight, the hook had found its mark. She scrambled backwards, her chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. until her back hit the far wall of the tower. She stared at the radio, at the small, glowing dial that was the source of this impossible personal terror. The voice whispered her name one last time, a long, drawn-out sound that seemed to stretch and warp in the air, and then the radio fell silent, leaving only the gentle hiss of an open channel. She was no longer just a listener, she was a target. The third day began not with the sun, but with the chilling echo of my own name whispered through a radio speaker. The fear was different now. It was no longer a vague, shapeless dread of the unknown. It had a voice, and it had a target. Me. I spent the morning in a state of hyper-vigilance, every creak of the tower, every gust of wind sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. The tower, my glass box in the sky, had transformed from a sanctuary of solitude into a transparent cage, and I felt the weight of an unseen gaze from the forest below. My father's warning was no longer enough. I needed to understand what he had been so afraid of. I needed answers, and the only person I could ask was long gone. My only option was to turn to his silent witness, the one guide he had left behind, his journal. I opened the worn, leather-bound book again, but this time I wasn't just reading for comfort. I was on a desperate hunt for clues, my eyes scanning for the pages, for any mention of a voice, of a radio, of someone's name being whispered across the static after midnight. I spent hours poring over his familiar, steady script, page after page of weather patterns, trail maintenance logs, and accounts of lost hikers found safe and sound. It was the chronicle of a competent, rational man. There was nothing that suggested a belief in the supernatural, nothing to explain the absolute, unwavering terror in his warning to me. I was about to give up, my frustration mounting, when my fingers brushed against a thick bulge in the back of the journal. Tucked into a leather sleeve on the inside back cover was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a standard park map. It was a hand-drawn, meticulously detailed topographical map of a single region, the Western Ridge, dominated by the stark gray summit of the Silent Peak. My heart began to pound. This was my father's private map, covered in his own annotations, but there weren't notes about elevation or trail conditions. They were about sound. Arrows indicated the direction of the prevailing winds, with notes like, "Sound carries here from the valley." Other areas were circled in red ink with the words, "Dead air zone, radio signal lost." He had been mapping the acoustic anomalies of the mountain, but it was the small, blue X marks that made the blood drain from my face. There were several scattered around the base and slopes of the peak. Next to one, he had written, "Lost signal from the Miller party here, 1998. Next to another, higher up the slope, a more chilling note. "Heard the echo again tonight. Sounded like Sarah." Who was Sarah? Another victim? Another ghost? I stared at the map, a cold, horrifying realization dawning on me. This wasn't a hobby. This was a secret, obsessive investigation. My father hadn't just been a ranger. He'd been a silent watchman, standing guard against the very thing that was now tormenting me. And this map, with its cryptic, terrifying notes, was the case file of a war I never knew he was fighting. Staring at my father's secret map, I felt a profound shift inside me. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but it was now mixed with a sense of grim purpose. This was a legacy, a secret war passed from a father to a daughter who never knew she'd been enlisted. The map was the battlefield, but the journal, I knew, must contain the rules of engagement. I turned back to the journal, my search now infused with a new, desperate intensity. I was no longer just looking for clues. I was looking for the story behind the map, for the events that had led my stoic, rational father to secretly document the impossible. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning for any mention of the lost climbers, the name Sarah, or the Silent Peak. I found it in a section from 20 years ago. The change in the handwriting was the first warning. His usually neat, steady script dissolved into a frantic, almost illegible scrawl, the pen strokes digging so deep they almost tore through the page. It was the writing of a man on the edge of breaking. October 12th, he had written, "The official search for the climbing party on the Silent Peak was called off today. 3 days, no tracks, no gear, nothing. They're gone. The official report will say an avalanche." He had then drawn a thick, angry line across the page. The entry below it was dated 2 days later, midnight. It happened again. I heard them on the radio, all 3 of them. Their voices were perfectly clear, as if they were broadcasting from the next ridge over. They were calling for help, saying they were injured, trapped in a crevasse near the summit. They gave coordinates. It sounded so real, Jenna. So damn real. My every instinct screamed at me to break protocol, to launch a solo rescue. I had my hand on the door, but something was wrong. The signal was too clean, no static, no wind, just their perfect, desperate voices. And they sounded exactly as they had on their last check-in 3 days ago. The exact same words, the exact same tremor of fear. It wasn't the call, it was a recording, a playback. The final words on the page were underlined 3 times, a frantic, desperate warning carved into the paper. It's a trap. It learns. It takes their voices, and it uses them. It uses your hope against you. Never answer. I closed the journal, the force of his terror reaching across the years and gripping my own heart. I finally understood the full, horrifying truth behind his absolute rule. It wasn't a superstition. It was a lesson learned from a harrowing near miss, a testament to an intelligent, adaptive predator. The thing on the radio wasn't a ghost. It was a hunter. And it had just spent 2 nights learning a new voice, mine. The knowledge from the journal changed everything. I was no longer just scared. I felt like I was in a race against time. The entity knew my name, and my father's journal had confirmed it's a thinking, learning predator. I needed more information to see if there's any official record of what my father wrote about. I needed to know if anyone else knew. I couldn't trust the radio at night, but during the day, it was my only link to the outside world. After a long, hesitant moment, I picked up the microphone, the plastic cool against my palm. I switched to the main park dispatch channel, my heart pounding. Station 73 to main dispatch, coming. The voice that answered was blessedly normal. A man named Dave, whose slightly bored tone was the most comforting sound I had heard in days. I tried to keep my own voice steady, professional, masking the terror that threatened to consume me. "Morning, Dave. Just doing my regional survey. I had a historical question about one of the peaks on my map here, a place called the Silent Peak." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The Silent Peak? That's in the restricted western zone, Jenna. No trail access up there. Terrain's unstable." "I know," I said, choosing my words carefully. I was reading some of the old station logs, mentioned the party of climbers who went missing there about 20 years back. "Is that right?" The silence on the radio stretched, and for a moment, I thought he had cut the connection. When he finally spoke, his voice was more cautious. "Yeah, that's right. Before my time. Big search, but they never found him. That's why the area is off limits. It's a dangerous mountain." I took a breath, preparing for the real question. "Have there been any others? Other incidents in that specific quadrant?" Another long, heavy pause. I could hear the faint sound of keyboard clicks in the background. "Let me see," Dave said, his voice now flat and noncommittal. "Records are old. Yeah, looks like we had a lone hiker vanish in that same area in 05. Another back in the late 90s, a hunter. Like I said, Jenna, it's dangerous terrain." He was using the same words, the same official explanation my father had written about, the same excuse used to bury the reports in the archives. It was the party line, the convenient lie told to keep people away, to keep the real truth hidden. "Thank you, Dave," I said, my voice a hollow whisper. That's all I needed. I signed off, the dispatcher's reluctant confirmation echoing in the small, silent room. It wasn't just a climbers, it wasn't just a one-time tragedy, it was a pattern, a feeding ground. And the official story was a thin, fragile whale hiding a history of disappearances, all leading back to that one silent beak. I sat in the profound silence that followed the radio call, the dispatcher's dismissive words, dangerous terrain echoing with a hollow falseness. The confirmation of other disappearances had only deepened the conspiracy, making me feel even more isolated. It wasn't just me and a strange voice anymore. It was me against a hidden, decades-long history that everyone, it seemed, had agreed to ignore. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. I was utterly alone in this. An hour later, as I was staring blankly at my father's annotated map, the radio crackled to life again, making me jump. But this time, it wasn't the main dispatch channel. It was a soft burst of static on the private ringer-to-ringer frequency. A voice, old and weathered, spoke my name. "Jenna, you there, kid?" I hesitated, my hand hovering over the microphone. "This is Ranger Jenna," I said cautiously. "Who is this?" "Never mind who this is," the old voice replied, a gentle but weary tone lacing his words. "I'm down at the main station. I overheard your call with Dave earlier. You're asking dangerous questions." My heart pounded. "The disappearances are real," I said, my voice a determined whisper. "Someone has to know why." There was a long sigh on the other end of the line. "Knowing why won't bring them back. It'll just get you added to the list." The old ranger paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more secretive. "Listen to me. The old-timers, the ones who worked these mountains before we had all this fancy digital gear, they had stories. Stories the Park Service doesn't want you to hear. They called it the ghost frequency." I gripped the microphone tighter. "The ghost frequency?" "Yeah," the voice crackled. "A signal that doesn't belong. It only comes in after midnight, and only in the high, lonely places. They said it gets inside your head, that it learns you. They said it likes to play with people who are all alone. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pricked at my skin. Your dad knew about it," the old ranger continued softly. "He and we talked about it once, a long time ago. He was one of the few who believed the stories were real. That rule he had, about turning the radio off after midnight, he had it for a damn good reason, kid. It's not a monster you can shoot, it's a whisper. And the only way to fight a whisper is with silence." "What is it?" I pleaded. "What does it want?" "Don't you get it?" the old man said, his voice filled with a sudden urgency. "It wants you to ask that question. It wants you to listen. It wants you to talk back. Don't do it. Don't trust the voice. Don't trust any voice you hear on that radio after dark. Do you understand me?" Before I could answer, the line clicked and went dead, leaving only static. I was left in the silent tower, my mind reeling. I wasn't crazy. The phenomenon was real. It had a name. And my father hadn't just been superstitious. He had been a soldier in a secret, silent war against it. The old ranger's warning left me in a state of cold, stark terror. The entity had a name, the ghost frequency, and a history. I spent my third day in the tower feeling like a prisoner on death row, watching the sun make its slow, indifferent arc across the sky, knowing that its disappearance would signal the beginning of my torment. I didn't read my father's journal anymore. I couldn't. It felt less like a guide and more like an epitaph for the man who had fought this thing and lost a part of himself in the process. That night, I sat before the radio, a silent, grim vigil. I wouldn't turn it off. I wouldn't hide. I would listen. I would face it. I needed to understand the weapon my enemy was using. At the stroke of midnight, the radio crackled to life. I braced myself for the distorted whisper of my own name. But the sound that came through was different. The static was gone. The distortion was gone. In its place was the clear, heartbreaking sound of a young woman crying. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated pain and fear. please." The voice sobbed, each word punctuated by a desperate gasp for air. "Can anyone hear me? I fell. I think my leg is broken. I'm so cold. My hands grip the edge of the table." My rational mind, armed with the warnings from my father and the old ranger, knew it was a lie. It was a trap, but the sound was so agonizingly real. The emotion in the voice was perfect. Then the entity played its hand. The voice began to weave my own private world into its tapestry of lies. The betrayal of my safety was absolute. "I just want to see my dad again," the voice cried, its sobs growing louder. "I miss him so much." I froze. Just that afternoon, I had been looking at a faded photograph of my father, my thumb tracing the outline of his smiling face, and had whispered those exact words to the empty room. "I miss you so much, Dad." My blood turned to ice. It was listening. It had been listening all day. The realization was a profound violation, a feeling of being seen in the most intimate corners of my own grief. The tower was not a shelter, it was a glass cage, and the entity was watching me through its walls, listening to every word, every sigh. The voice on the radio continued, its performance flawless. "The wind is so loud," it whispered. "It's coming through a crack. I'm so cold." Just hours earlier, I had put a strip of tape over a leaky seal on the main window, complaining aloud to myself about a whistling draft. I stared at the radio, my mind reeling. This wasn't just the mimic. It was an active, intelligent parasite. It was observing me, studying me, learning my fears, my sorrows, and the small details of my environment. And it was using all of it to construct a perfect, personalized lure. A lie so detailed and so intimate that it was becoming almost impossible to resist. The voice of my father fell silent, leaving a void in the room that was filled only by the sound of my own ragged, desperate breaths. I was no longer just a ranger in a remote tower. I was a daughter listening to the ghost of a man I had buried 6 months ago. The entity had escalated its attack, moving beyond simple mimicry and into the realm of emotional warfare. The supernatural phenomena were now directly attacking my greatest personal weakness, my grief. A fierce, silent battle erupted within my mind. One part of me, the ranger my father had trained, was a voice of cold, hard logic. It methodically listed the facts, presenting them like evidence in the court of law. Fact 1. It is after midnight. Fact 2. The journal explicitly warned that the entity mimics the voices of the dead. Fact 3. The old ranger confirmed it. Fact 4. It knew your name. Fact 5. It used your own private words against you. This logical part of me was screaming. A frantic, desperate voice of reason, telling me that the voice on the radio was a performance. A monstrous, predatory lie. But the other part of me, the part that was a grieving daughter, refused to listen. This part of me was a raw, open wound, and the voice on the radio was a soothing balm. It didn't just sound like my father, it felt like him. It had his warmth, his kindness, the specific, gentle cadence he always used when he called me honey. It was the voice that had read me bedtime stories, the voice that had calmed my fears, the voice I had longed to hear every single day for the past 6 months. This part of me was consumed by a tidal wave of desperate, irrational hope. What if he wasn't gone? What if he was trapped somewhere? What if this is my one chance to save him? I was being torn apart. I paced the small, claustrophobic room, my hands tangled in my hair, my shadow a frantic, dancing figure on the glass walls. It's not him, I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. It can't be him. As if sensing my doubt, the voice on the radio returned, its tone perfectly calculated to soothe my fear. I know this is hard to believe, sweetheart, my father's voice said, a gentle tremor of pain in his words. I can't explain it. I just know I'm here, and I'm hurt, and I need my daughter. His words were a key turning in the lock of my grief. The logical ranger was losing the battle. I was no longer fighting a monster in the dark. I was fighting the desperate, all-consuming hope of a daughter who just wanted her father back. I was adrift in a storm of grief and confusion, my rationality battered by the impossible hope that my father's voice had offered. The entity on the radio, wearing the perfect mask of my father, seemed to understand my internal war. It knew that the logical ranger inside me was still fighting, still clinging to the wreckage of the real world. And it knew exactly how to silence that voice for good. "I know you're scared, honey," my father's voice said, its tone gentle and filled with a paternal understanding that was almost unbearable. "I know this doesn't make sense. You need proof. Your old man understands that." The voice paused, as if gathering its strength. "Go outside in the morning. When the sun is up, look at the base of the tower's western leg, the one that faces the silent peak. I'll leave you a sign. Something to prove is really me." After that, the radio went silent for the rest of the night. I did not sleep. I sat at the table, staring out the glass walls at the star-filled sky. My mind, a blank slate of shock and anticipation. The entity had given me a testable hypothesis, a physical piece of data to seek out in the morning. It was a brilliant, cruel move, a direct challenge to the scientific mind that was my last defense. I spent the long hours waiting for the dawn, torn between the terror of what I might find and the even greater terror of what I might not. When the first rays of sun finally crested the distant mountains, I felt a pull of dreadful purpose. I descended the long, rickety staircase from the tower, room to the ground. Each step a thunderous boom in the quiet morning air. The forest was beautiful, bathed in the soft, golden light of dawn. But I saw none of it. My eyes were fixed on the base of the tower's massive steel legs. I rounded the corner to the western leg, the one that faced the silent peak, and there, lying on a patch of dark earth, half covered in pine needles, was my father's old compass. It wasn't a copy, it was his. I knew it instantly. It was a heavy, brass instrument with a specific, star-shaped scratch on the glass face where he'd once dropped it on the rescue mission. The worn brown leather lanyard was the one I had braided for him at summer camp when she was a little girl. This compass should have been in the top drawer of his old desk in my childhood home, 400 miles away. Yet, here it was. The supernatural phenomena had now delivered a physical, tangible piece of evidence. I knelt down, my hand trembling as I picked it up. The metal was cold, real. This was a final, devastating blow to my skepticism. A voice could be a trick of radio waves. A feeling could be a product of grief. But this compass, this solid, heavy piece of my father's life, was an impossible fact. My father's warning, his journal, the old ranger's plea, it all vanished from my mind, burned away by the undeniable proof I now held in my hand. It was him. He was out there, and he needed me. I climbed the long stairs back up to the tower room. My father's brass compass clutched tightly in my hand. Its cold, solid weight was an anchor in the sea of impossibility. And to me, it was undeniable proof. The fear that had kept me paralyzed for 2 nights was replaced by a new, powerful emotion, a desperate, determined hope. My father was out there. He was hurt, he was trapped, and he was calling for me. The warnings in his journal, the words of the old ranger, they were the frightened reactions of men who didn't understand. But I was his daughter. I would not abandon him. With my newfound courage, I turned back to his journal, the one guide I had left. I realized now that I hadn't finished it. I had stopped reading after his frantic, terrifying entry about the trap, too afraid to see where his paranoia might lead. But now, I needed to know everything. I needed to understand what he had faced, what he had learned. I turned to the very last pages of the book, the ones he had written in the final months of his life, back at home, long after his time at the park was over. This was my final search for the dark truth of the land. The handwriting was different here. It was no longer the steady, confident script of a seasoned ranger, nor was it the frantic scrawl of a terrified man. It was the shaky, weakened hand of a man who knew he was unwell, a man grappling with his own mortality. The entries were no longer about the park. They were philosophical, regretful. November 5th, he had written, "The doctors say it's the heart. Weakened. Ironic. I spent my whole life in the mountains, my body a machine. Now the engine is failing." I felt a pang of sorrow, my eyes blurring with tears. I turned to the very last entry, written just a week before he died. It was not about his health. It was about the mountain. January 12th, it began. I can't stop thinking about the silent peak, about the voices. I was wrong to call them a trap. A trap is intelligent. A trap has a will. This is something older. I think of it now as an echo. The mountains are old, and they hold on to things. A powerful emotion, like the terror of a dying climber, could leave an imprint, a psychic scar on the landscape. A voice trapped in the rock and the ice, replaying itself in the static. My heart pounded as I read on, his words seeming to give me the very explanation I so desperately needed. But what if it's more than that? He wrote, his handwriting growing more unsteady. What if there is something there? Something that feeds on those echoes? Something that consumes those scars? It is drawn to strong emotions, not just fear, but grief and love. It uses them. It wears them like a mask to draw you in. I read the final lines, and in my hopeful, grief-stricken state, I completely misinterpreted his final, terrible warning. I saw his words not as a description of a monster, but as an explanation for a miracle. My father's love for me, his powerful spirit, had left an imprint so strong that it was calling out to me. The entity wasn't a predator. It was just a conduit, an ancient, natural amplifier. I closed the journal, my theory now fully formed. It was him, and the compass was his sign. I now believed, with all my heart, that I was not being lured into a trap, but guided toward a rescue. I closed the journal, a single tear tracing a path down my dust-stained cheek. I felt a profound sense of clarity. The fear and confusion were replaced by a singular driving purpose. The warnings from my father, the frantic scribbles about a trap, those were from a time when he was afraid, when he didn't understand, but his final, calmer words revealed the truth. The entity wasn't a monster, it was an echo, a natural phenomenon, and my father's powerful spirit, his love for me, was using it to call for help. My grief had twisted his final warning into a confirmation of my own desperate hope. But the narrator, the silent observer of this tragedy, knows the truth that Jenna's hopeful mind refused to see. The truth was there, in those final, shaky entries. But it was a truth so monstrous, so contrary to the idea of a loving soul, that she was incapable of comprehending it. This was her father's final, terrible hypothesis, the true revelation about the nature of the entity on the silent peak. He wrote, "It is not a conduit, it is a predator." He had theorized that the entity was a form of acoustic parasite. It had no physical form, no will, no consciousness in any way a human could understand it. It was a void, but it was a void that could record. It absorbed the final, powerful psychic and emotional energies of those who died within its territory, their voices, their fears, their strongest memories, their deepest loves. It didn't capture their souls, it captured the data of their souls. And then it used those recordings, it played them back, weaving them into a perfect, irresistible lure to draw new, living sources of emotion into its range. It was a ghoulish anglerfish, dangling the ghost of a loved one in the deep, dark abyss to attract its next meal. And what did it feed on? The journal entry was clear. It fed on the fresh, powerful emotions of the living, the terror, the confusion, the desperation, and most of all, the intense, overwhelming hope of a potential rescue. These feelings were its nourishment. This was the dark truth of the land. The voice on the radio was not Jenna's father. It was a perfect predatory echo, a recording of her father's voice, his love, and his memory, now weaponized against his own daughter. It was the most sophisticated trap imaginable, and Jenna, in her grief, had just armed it herself. As she stood in the tower, clutching the compass like a holy relic and believing she was preparing for a rescue, she was in fact preparing herself for the slaughter. I spent the rest of the day in a state of focused, determined preparation. The profound, paralyzing fear from the night before had been replaced by the powerful, driving force of my misguided hope. Believing I was preparing for a rescue mission, I meticulously checked my gear, consulting my father's maps, and planning a route toward the base of the silent peak. The tragic irony was lost on me. I was preparing for a reunion, while the entity, the true recipient of my efforts, was simply waiting for the sun to set. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to change. The brilliant, clear blue of the mountain morning darkened to a bruised, unsettling shade of purple and gray. Clouds, thick and heavy, rolled in with an unnatural speed, swallowing the distant peaks and casting the entire forest into a premature twilight. I watched the change from my glass perch, a minor annoyance in my mind, a delay to my plans. I failed to see it for what it truly was. The entity beginning to manifest its power, a physical assault on my world. The storm hit the tower not with a warning, but with a sudden, explosive violence. The wind came first, a physical wall of force that slammed into the tower, making the entire structure groan and sway on its steel legs. Rain followed, not in drops, but in blinding, horizontal sheets that turned the glass walls into a churning, liquid gray, completely obscuring the world outside. Then came the lightning, jagged bolts of white-hot energy that tore the sky apart, followed by claps of thunder so loud and so close they felt like physical blows, shaking the tower to its very foundation. I was thrown back from a window as a particularly close strike of lightning hit a nearby ridge. The flash, a blinding white that left spots dancing in my vision. The single string of battery-powered lights I had hung in the cabin flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the room into a deep, terrifying darkness, lit only by the strobing, epileptic flashes of the storm outside. My heart pounded. The power, the solar panels. I scrambled for my heavy-duty flashlight and aimed its beam at the ceiling, at the wires that led to the roof. They were sparking faintly. I knew, with a sinking feeling of dread, what had happened. The small, fragile solar array that powered my lights and my satellite phone had been shattered by the storm's fury. The realization was a cold, hard slap. My connection to the outside world, the satellite phone, my laptop, even the lights was severed. I was now completely, utterly cut off, alone in a glass box, being battered by a storm at the top of the world. And in the darkness, I saw that one thing was still working. On the central desk, a small green power light glowed with a soft, steady luminescence. It was my father's old radio, running on its heavy, internal batteries. In a deliberate, strategic act of horrifying power, the entity had destroyed my world, leaving me with only one way to speak and only one voice to listen to, its own. I sat in the heart of the raging storm, the darkness of the tower broken only by the frantic, dancing beam of my flashlight. The world had been reduced to this single, swaying room, a cage of glass and steel suspended in a chaos of wind and rain. The silence from the radio was a heavy, waiting thing, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it would not last. At precisely midnight, as a particularly violent crash of thunder shook the tower, the radio crackled to life. It was his voice again, my father's voice, but the warmth was gone, replaced by a weak, strained whisper. the sound of a man at the absolute limit of his strength. "Jenna," the voice rasped, each word a struggle. "Honey, the storm. It's so cold. I don't have much time." I crawled toward the desk, my flashlight beam trembling, the sound of his pain breathing through the speaker, a physical agony in my own chest. I was beyond reason now, beyond the warnings in the journal. All that was left was the raw, primal instinct of a daughter listening to her father suffer. "Dad?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "Dad, where are you?" "Near the peak," he answered, his voice growing weaker. "The silent peak. But they can't find me. The signal is too weak." He coughed, a wet, ragged sound that tore at my heart. "Jenna, listen to me. You have to help me. It's the only way." The voice paused, and then it made its final, terrible demand. "In the tower, there's an emergency broadcast beacon. The red box on the wall? Your old man made sure every tower had one. You have to turn it on, sweetheart. It will send out a powerful wideband signal. A homing signal. The rescue teams, they'll be able to lock onto it. They can find me then. Please, Jenna, I'm dying." This was the entity's ultimatum, its final, perfectly crafted move. It wasn't asking me to speak to it anymore. It was asking me to perform an act of rescue, an act my father had dedicated his entire life to. It was using the very core of his legacy as a weapon against me. To save the ghost of my father, I had to use the one tool designed to save real, living people. I looked across the dark room at the red emergency box on the wall, its glass cover glinting in my flashlight beam. My father's last written words screamed at me from the pages of his journal. "It's a trap. Never answer." But the sound of his dying breath on the radio was all I could hear. I stood paralyzed between the two legacies of my father, the desperate, dying voice on the radio and the calm, rational warning in his journal. The storm raged outside, and inside me, a war was being fought for my soul. The voice on the radio grew weaker, a final, heartbreaking plea. "Jenna, please, don't leave me." The written words on the page seemed to scream back at me in silent, steady ink. Silence is the only weapon. For a long, agonizing moment, the ranger my father had trained held her ground. I saw the logic, I understood the trap. But the entity was too clever. It wasn't just attacking my mind, it was attacking my heart. And my heart was still a raw, open wound of grief. In that final moment, my love for my father proved to be a more powerful force than his own warning. A single, tearful thought bloomed in my mind. A desperate and beautiful piece of logic that only a grieving daughter could construct. What if he was wrong? What if this time was different? What if my love for him and his for me is the one thing the entity can't fake? What if that's the one power strong enough to break the rules of this place? It was a hope so powerful it became a certainty. I had to try. I would not sit here in silence and let my father die a second time. With a final, tearful look at the journal, I turned my back on my father's warning and walked towards the red emergency beacon on the wall. My movements were no longer hesitant. They were filled with a new, tragic purpose. As I approached the box, the voice on the radio whispered one last time, a sound of perfect, loving encouragement. "That's my girl." My hand did not tremble. With the butt of my flashlight, I shattered the glass cover of the emergency beacon. The sound of the breaking glass was sharp and final, the sound of a rule being irrevocably broken. I reached inside and, with a steady, determined motion, I flipped the heavy-duty switch. Instantly, a deafening, high-pitched electronic tone filled the tower, and a powerful red light on the box began to pulse, flooding the dark room in a rhythmic, crimson glow. The beacon was active. A signal of hope or of doom was now screaming out into the storm across the silent peaks and the dark, waiting forest. I turned back to the radio. my face streaked with tears, but illuminated by a look of triumphant, desperate love. I had made my choice. I had broken the rule. And now, I waited for my father's grateful reply. The emergency beacon pulsed, filling the small tower with a rhythmic crimson light and a piercing electronic tone. I stared at the radio, my body trembling with a mixture of fear and wild, desperate hope. I had done it. I had broken the rule, defied the cryptic warnings, and chosen to believe in my father's voice. Now, I waited, listening for his words of gratitude, for instructions on how the rescue teams would find him. A voice crackled through the speaker. It was his voice, and he spoke a single word, finally. But the tone was all wrong. The warmth, the pain, the gentle familiarity were gone. This voice was cold, ancient, and resonant with a triumphant, horrifying power. And then it began to laugh. It was a sound that would haunt me for the rest of my days. A dry, rasping, and utterly monstrous sound that twisted my father's beloved voice into an instrument of pure malice. The laugh grew louder, deeper, and then other voices joined in, dozens of them. A chaotic, terrifying cacophony of voices erupted from the radio at once. It was a storm of sound, a chorus of the damned. I could hear the voices of the lost climbers screaming in a cacophony of terror. I heard the woman who had cried for help, now laughing insanely. I heard the faint, ghostly whispers of other victims, all of them now speaking at once, their voices a tidal wave of madness. The aftermath had begun, and the cause of my action was horrifyingly clear. In that moment of pure, undiluted horror, I finally understood the true nature of the trap. The emergency beacon wasn't a tool to call for rescue. It was an amplifier. The entity hadn't just wanted me to answer, it had manipulated me into giving it a voice that could reach beyond the lonely peak. My father's rule, silence is the only weapon, wasn't just to protect me. It was to protect the world. I had not just sprung the trap on myself, I had opened the door of the cage, and with the power of the emergency beacon, I had unleashed the collected, hungry echoes of the silent peak out onto the airwaves. A psychic plague broadcast to anyone, anywhere, who might be listening. I scrambled toward the radio, my mind shattered, my only thought to silence the terrible chorus I had unleashed. As the cacophony of stolen voices screamed from the radio, a sound amplified and broadcast by the pulsing red beacon, I scrambled across the floor. My mind was a singular, white-hot point of panic, focused on one goal: make it stop. I reached the desk, my hands fumbling blindly for the radio's power knob, my ears ringing with the tormented screams of the lost. I twisted the knob, but the voices didn't stop. They continued to pour out, fueled by the powerful signal of the emergency beacon. It wasn't the radio that was the source anymore, it was the beacon. I lunged for the red box on the wall, my fingers finding the heavy-duty switch I had flipped only moments before in a state of desperate hope. With a cry of pure anguish, I slammed it back down. The piercing electronic tone died, the pulsing red light went out, and the radio went silent. The sudden, absolute silence was a physical blow, a void so profound it felt like the world had ended. The storm outside had begun to subside, its fury spent, and the mountain returned to its deep, ancient quiet. But it was not the peaceful silence I had first found here. This was a dead, hollow silence, a silence pregnant with the memory of the horrors that had just filled it. It was the silence of a tomb. I collapsed to the floor, my body trembling uncontrollably in the darkness. I was alone, truly, completely alone. My father's ghost was gone, the illusion shattered, leaving behind only the cold, hard truths of my mistake. I had been warned by the living and the dead, by my father's own hand, and in my grief, I had chosen to listen to the monster. I had survived, but I was not whole. A part of me had been scoured away, leaving an empty space where my hope and my love for my father had once been. I stayed there on the floor for the rest of the night, waiting. I waited for the voice to return, to taunt me, to punish me. But it never came. The radio remained silent. The entity had gotten what it wanted, a moment of amplification, a chance to broadcast its chorus of suffering out into the world. And now, it was done with me. The silence that followed was its final, most cruel act of torture, leaving me with nothing but the screaming echo of my own failure. The storm passed as quickly and unnaturally as it had arrived. Dawn broke, and the mountain was reborn, washed clean by the rain, glittering under a crystal clear sky. It was a morning of profound, breathtaking beauty. But inside the tower, the darkness remained. I hadn't moved. I sat on the cold floor, wrapped in the rough wool blanket, my back against the wall. I didn't sleep. I didn't cry. I just stared, my eyes fixed on the silent, dead radio on the desk. The chorus of damned souls I had unleashed was gone, but the echo of their screams and the sound of my father's monstrous laughter were now permanently etched into my mind. Sometime after noon, a new sound intruded on my silence. It was the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of a helicopter's rotor blades growing steadily louder. The emergency beacon, in the single, chaotic minute it had been active, had done its job. It had sent out a distress signal, and the world of rules and procedures was now responding. The helicopter landed in the clearing, and two rangers, clad in the same familiar professional uniform I had once worn with pride, made their way up the tower stairs. They were expecting to find a ranger in distress, perhaps injured by the storm. They found the smashed glass of the beacon cover, the overturned furniture, and the dead radio. And in the middle of it all, they found me. I was physically unharmed, but the woman they found was just a shell. My eyes were open, but they were vacant, staring through them at a horror they could not see. They spoke to me, their voices filled with a gentle, professional concern. "Ma'am? Ranger? Can you hear me? My name's Mark. We're here to help you." I heard the words, but they were like sounds from a great distance, a language from a world I no longer belonged to. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The part of me that could form words, the part of me that could connect with another human being, had been scarred away by the voices on the radio. They gently helped me to my feet and led me from the tower, my movements pliant and unresponsive. As the helicopter lifted off the ground, carrying me away from the lonely peak, I stared out the window. I saw the vast, green ocean of the forest stretching out below, and in the distance, the stark, gray summit of the silent peak. I had physically escaped, but I was not whole. A part of me, the part that knew my own name, the part that could feel anything other than a cold, hollow dread, had been left behind in that glass box in the sky. The evil was not vanquished. It had simply retreated, and the haunting now followed me in the silence. The official report was simple and tragic. Ranger Jenna, a rookie, had suffered a severe psychotic break due to the extreme isolation of her post, exacerbated by the trauma of a violent thunderstorm. She was found in a catatonic state and was honorably discharged for medical reasons. She was moved to a quiet care facility back east, where she lived in a world of profound silence, never speaking another word. Her case was closed. The park and the world moved on. Months later, hundreds of miles away, in a different national park, another ranger sat through a long, quiet night in another glass box perched on another lonely mountain. His name was Thomas, and he was a seasoned veteran. His shift, a comfortable routine of reading paperback novels and listening to the gentle hiss of the radio. The night was clear and calm. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Thomas stretched, pouring himself a cup of stale, black coffee. The picture of a man completely at ease in the vast, silent wilderness. And then his radio crackled. It was a faint signal on an old, seldom used emergency frequency. It was weak, broken up by static, but there was a voice underneath. He leaned closer to the speaker, turning up the volume. It was a woman's voice, a thin, desperate, whisper. "Help," it said. Thomas put his coffee down, his senses suddenly on high alert. He grabbed a notepad. "Unidentified signal. Can you repeat your message?" he said into his microphone. The voice on the radio came again, a little clearer this time, a sound laced with a strange, distorted echo. "Where are you?" Thomas frowned, confused. It wasn't a standard distress call. It sounded strange. The voice was familiar, but he couldn't place it. He thought back, trying to remember if it was the voice of a hiker he'd spoken to, or maybe another ranger. He didn't know that he was listening to the newest addition to an ancient and hungry collection. He didn't know that the evil had not been vanquished, that the haunting was not over. He leaned in close to the speaker, his ear just inches away, listening intently. And then the voice spoke one last time, its whisper now perfectly clear, a chilling, impossible echo broadcast from a lonely peak hundreds of miles away. It was the voice of Ranger Jenna, and that is where the story ends. Or perhaps it is where it begins again. The official report on Ranger Thomas would simply state that he abandoned his post for unknown reasons. His truck was found at the trailhead. His pack was found a mile into the woods, but of the man himself, no trace was ever found. The silent peak keeps its secrets, and the hungry, patient echo that lives there has a new voice in its collection, a new lure to cast out into the lonely darkness. It is a virus of sound, an ancient sorrow that spreads through the quiet places of the world, carried on the airwaves, waiting for a compassionate soul to listen. So this is the final warning. In the vast, silent places, be wary of the voices that cry out for help. Be wary of the sounds of the lost and the lonely and the dead. Some rules, the ones passed down in whispers by those who have seen the darkness at the edge of the world, are there for a reason. And the most important one is this: never ever answer an echo. Thank you for listening to this account. The world is filled with strange signals and unexplained transmissions, whispers on the static between worlds. What do you think is the most frightening sound to hear when you are truly alone? Let us know in the comments below. If this story from the Silent Peak left you with a chill, please leave a like to support the channel. It lets the darkness know you were listening. And if you wish to hear more transmissions from the void, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. You never know who might be calling for you next.